We configured it. We can use it for other reasons. We can use it as like a cache to store some data. Um, Another popular use of Redis is for background jobs. So I want to talk about background job processing. Um, the way background jobs happen in Redis, sorry, in Ruby and Rails is through ActiveJob. So ActiveJob was added in Rails 4.2 to manage all of our background jobs. So it's very similar to how like Active Record, right, is the object relational model for our database, right? It's not the database, but it's our interface between our app and the database, right? So Active Record handles all of our models. ActiveJob is the same thing. It's not a background job execution system, but it's a way to interface with the background job execution system. So it abstracts out some of the implementation of specific background jobs and their like processes, and instead let you interact with ActiveJob, and then you can schedule an active job, you can run an active job, and then the background job process itself handles it, right? So any mature application will probably need background jobs. For example, sending out email. Maybe if a user hasn't logged in for a day, you want to send them an email and say, hey, check out this cool notification, come back in, right? Or maybe somebody messages them in the app, you send them an email notification, and that could be a background job. Maybe you want to scrape information, so maybe every hour you want to hit like a public API, get some more information and display that. So you probably want a background job that gets run every so often, right? And kind of executes that operation. So there's a lot of reasons for a background job. For our application, I want to use background jobs to handle message sending. So here in the application, right, we create a message and we immediately go ahead and broadcast it out to everybody. What's the problem with this? Right? Well, it happens all in line. It's all in the span of one request. So let's say there's like, if there's just 10 users, we're broadcasting out the message to 10 users. That's probably all right, not a big deal. What if there's like a million users, right? A lot of users who are all getting this one message. Well, the user who actually sent the message will have to wait until this action completes because it happens in line, right? It's one after the other. It's a serial execution. When this line gets run, the user has to wait for it to finish, and then their application, right? Then their application can go ahead and respond. And so it's inline. It ties up the web server that has to deal with it inline, and then the user who sent the request is also tied up while that happens. And so that's not very productive. That's kind of a poor experience for that user. So let's go ahead and maybe convert this to a background job. So we're going to comment it out, and let's say we want to move it to a job. So we're going to say something like broadcast message job. And this job will be responsible for broadcasting out messages to clients, and we'll ask it to perform later. And what do we pass in? We're passing the same things. We're passing the topic, and then we'll pass in a message data. All right, so same thing as before. And what happens this, right? Well, this is not defined, so let's go ahead and define it. So with all things Rails, oops, that's our server. Here we go. There's a way to make things easy. So we can run Rails generate, and when we run it, we generate a job. And what's our job? It's broadcast message. But because it's already going to be a job, we actually don't need to find job twice. And it'll create for us a file to handle. There we go. So we have now broadcast message job. Let's take a look. So this is our job. It inherits from application job. So with ActiveJob, you can define the different queue. So you could have multiple queues if you say you want to give preference to a certain type of job over other jobs. So you can have like a priority queue or maybe a low priority queue, so jobs that aren't very important that can get run forever. Maybe you want to break things out so you have like paying users and free users on different queues, or maybe notifications or a different queue than everything else. Up to you. And you see here a perform action. The perform action will get called whenever the job gets picked up. So the arguments you pass in or whatever arguments you want, right? So we said the arguments are going to be a stream room and then some data. And what do we want it to do? Well, we basically want it to do what we were doing before inline, which is to send out the broadcast like that. And now we just want to pass out the data as is, right? So we get some data. So we say, all right, go ahead in the context of a background job now. So no longer inline, right? This job gets picked up by the background. go ahead and send this out. So this is right ActiveJob, right? You can read all about it, but the purpose is basically to have things that you don't want to happen inline. Many uses for it. You create jobs. Same thing here, right? You have your job, you have your queues. You can define different queues. Perform is how the job gets called. The job gets called, it gets picked up, it gets called .perform, and anything you define here will get run. The ways to call it is perform later. Is basically go ahead and enqueue the job, and whenever the job gets to the top of the queue, it'll get picked up and run immediately. So if the queue is size 0, it'll go picked up immediately. We call it in here. The other way we could do this is we could say perform now. And perform now will be go ahead and run the job right now in the context of whoever's calling it. So rather than schedule it as a background job, it'll actually run it whatever process calls it. And either of those, right, no matter what you do, it'll still call perform here. So this is, ActiveJob knows how to handle it and knows how to handle perform now or perform later. So it's just a matter of scheduling it, but either way, it goes through and calls perform. So maybe let's try this out. So let's open up the Rails console. And we had broadcast message job. We can say perform now. And there's like, some sort of room, just some test, right? You notice here it's performing it. Go ahead and perform it. And let's actually added some Rails logging so we know. Cool. Oops. There we go. Reload. Cool. So we get our output. Right, we perform now. Now notice if we call perform later, right? What do we expect is going to happen? So perform now actually went ahead and ran the job in the context of whoever was calling it. In this case, the Rails console was calling the job. So the Rails console, the context, went ahead and ran the job. If we call perform later, what do we expect? Well, we expect it to enqueue the job first, right? So the job is enqueued. And you see here it's enqueued with an ID, arguments, the queue it's on, the priority, and then went ahead and actually, after it queued it, went ahead and ran it. And looks like it ran. There we go. So it enqueued it first, and then since it's top of the queue, it picked it up and went ahead and actually ran it. So that's kind of the difference between perform now and perform later. So ActiveJob, right, is the kind of the abstraction layer. It doesn't actually handle the actual job execution, but it handles kind of creating jobs and queuing jobs. So how do we actually start to use background execution? So there's actually many ways to do it. I want to cover just a few of them here. So ActiveJob here talks about using different queuing backends. The most common ones are Sidekiq, Rescue, and Delayed Job, which we can read about. So Sidekiq and Rescue are very similar. They both use Redis to handle the job queue. So when you queue a job, it writes it to Redis, and then it picks it up and runs the job. Sidekiq is very efficient. It's actually the fastest one out there. You'll see here some performance benchmarks. Number of time it takes to process 100,000 jobs. Rescue and Delayed Job are actually quite heavy, a lot of time. Sidekiq, by comparison, is very fast. The reason is it actually uses multiple threads to handle the jobs. So with other systems, to keep one thread per job. Sidekiq does multiple threads. The downside is you have to make sure that all of your code is thread safe, because it's possible that they can run on the same time with multiple threads. So Sidekiq is definitely the most popular one, I'd say. Rescue is also very similar. Rescue and actually Sidekiq are interchangeable, so you can actually use them back and forth. If you wanted to, you actually could even use them both, but that's kind of useless. The last one I mentioned is Delayed Job, also very popular. I think just a little different syntax, but all of these are very useful, and ActiveJob works with all of them. So with ActiveJob, you just have to specify which one you want to use, and then make sure you also set it up appropriately. So we're going to use Sidekiq. So let's check out the Getting Started page. ActiveJob also tells us that in order to set it up, we have to define this in our application.rb file. So if you notice, our application.rb file is here, and it's in the config folder. So we can go ahead and define it here, right? That makes sense. There's really nothing else defined in this, so it kind of feels a little odd to define it here, and it's not very used a lot. You notice it says config environment would take precedence, so if we want, we could put it in here. But we have to define it in every instance, so if we want to use it in all three, you have to define it in all three. It's not really great either. Here, though, we start to get some config, so maybe we can define something similar. So maybe we can say, like a Sidekiq. And you notice here it says rails.application.config. So maybe we can do rails.application, and then rather than put the config here, we could do this, but I'm going to comment that out. Maybe we can just do it like that. I believe that should work. What else do we need to do? Well, let's check out the getting started. And a bit confusing how to use this with Active Record. One thing we do need for sure is the gem. So we're going to go ahead and add in Sidekiq. And let's see. So we're actually going to click here on Active Record and ask for it to help us. So we set up Sidekiq. Great. Generate jobs. Looks like that is it from setting up. Anything else? That's it. Sweet. So we'll save our gem file. Exit out of this. We'll go ahead and run bundle. We have our Roku logs here. Great. We have our Redis logs here. Fantastic. Maybe we want to run a local server. So we have our server. Right. So the way we can run Sidekiq is actually, so Rails S, right, runs our Rails server. That's great. That handles our web requests. But right now, if we want to run Sidekiq, we have nothing actually running it, right? We need to have a process that runs it. So we actually can just type in Sidekiq, and it'll go ahead and run it for us. Great. So now we have Sidekiq up and running with some kind of cool graphics. So this will handle all of our job queuing. So it picks up jobs out of the queue and runs them. So if we queue a job with ActiveJob, Sidekiq in this context will be responsible for actually running the job. So we have Sidekiq open, we have our Rails server open. Great. Let's see if we have our local host. This is the same one as last week. You still see a lot of the messages, and I guess it didn't have some good state here. Create a new room. ActiveJob. Let's see. Great, so we have here in our code perform later. So we expect to queue the job, and the job should get picked up, and then the job gets picked up, it'll broadcast things out. So here is our server logs, and you notice we started, let's see if we see our post request. So here's our post request, right, which was creating the message. And then later on, the job gets picked up, and it broadcasts it. And we find, I guess the name of the job, it's broadcast. Don't see our output statements. Make sure I define it properly. Gotta find it that way. Cool. Restart all our services. Oops. Notice when I killed Redis, Sidekiq was throwing a bunch of errors. So it uses Redis to store all the queues. Cool. Here. Right, so now the job, let's see if the console are connected. So here we go. So we queued the job down here. Queued it. And Here it looks like it started, and then it finished, so it ran it. So I don't know why I didn't get the information. Let's see. We pass in the topic. It's good. Stream room, data, queue as default. Sidekiq. So a lot of this getting started pages are before. We'll check out ActiveJob real quickly. Okay, looks like we set it up properly. Config ActiveJob queue adapter Sidekiq, and we have it in here. Jump Sidekiq. Oh, looks like it's set up properly. I'm just curious why we didn't get the message. So I queued it, but nothing is picking it up. Open the console, maybe try to debug this. So I guess we can't, right, I'm having a little trouble figuring this out, which is actually a good thing because the next thing is how to figure out how to debug and work with monitoring this stuff and kind of improving it. So there's actually a thing called Sidekiq Web. So find the documentation. Which is useful to help kind of figure out how to inspect all your jobs. So the way to do it is similar to kind of how we mounted Action Cable. You gotta modify the routes. So we'll modify our routes, and we'll have to add in Sidekiq route, and then require it here. We'll restart our web server. Then once it's up, we can go to our local host /Sidekiq. And it provides for us this handy UI. So we can have to see all the jobs we processed. Let's say we processed one, history of jobs. Notice just as an aside that it's using polling, right, not WebSockets. Polling is totally okay. In this case, why is it using polling? Well, it's really asking for the latest state of the app every so often, every 5 or 10 seconds. So it doesn't really make sense to constantly be pushing updates anytime there's like a new job. Rather, it just says at a fixed interval, go ahead and give me the latest, which makes sense. So if your job fails, it'll tell you up here if it fails, what the queue was. Looks like we have a process running, 25 threads, some dead queues. So just a handy resource to kind of inspect all of your jobs and see what's going on. Notice here is retries. You can configure your jobs to retry upon failure. Maybe the job is working with a different API and that API goes down. So maybe you want to reschedule the job in like 5 minutes or something. So I believe, let's see, you inspect the wiki. You can, let's see. You can schedule jobs. So if you want to put jobs into the future, you can say, oh, actually, ActiveJob handles that. So if you want to queue a job in the future, you can do that with ActiveJob. You can say wait until some time. So maybe you want to say in 1 week from now, go ahead and send an email or something. But there's ways to also retry your job if it fails. I thought, whatever. So there are ways to do it, and so this is Sidekiq. Sidekiq Web is useful for looking at all your dashboards. If you deploy this to production, though, what will happen? Right? Any old user can then go to this URL if they know it exists and look at all your jobs. Right? So probably not the best idea. You probably want to put this behind some sort of protection. So remember how we did back in week 2 with user authentication, and we defined a before action. We said authenticate user. Maybe we do something similar for this page. So if they try to get to the Sidekiq route, maybe we say, unless you're like an administrator of this website, it redirects you to the homepage. And there's you can you're right. You want to basically want to protect this because this is more of like a configuration tool, and so it's useful to have on production, but we don't necessarily want to expose this to everyone who is curious and wants to kind of see what type of jobs are being run. Let's see, so you can see on the busy, you can see the jobs. Let's see if we can do something here. So maybe we say sleep for 10 seconds. Rails logger, just you can define different levels. You can define info or error, and so if you want, you can filter down by that. So you can say only show me the errors, only show me the info. It's just a higher level abstraction. Puts is basically for like debugging in the command line while you're building, but this is more for adding things into production. So like the Heroku has a whole complex logplex, and it kind of handles Rails logger. So maybe we open Rails console. So I added in a sleep just to make the job run longer. Right? Maybe the job takes more time, so we can artificially do that. So if we say perform now, how fast this is. So it's sleeping. Yeah, I think I have it running. Oops, here. Perform now performs it here. Yeah. So it's slept and wake up. Oh, so it won't actually go through this. Oh, you're right. We'll go through the Sidekiq client because it handles it right away. So maybe if we call perform later. Already finished. There we go. So now the job is running down here. So you can see the job. You can see the arguments, which is useful if you're trying to debug things or get a sense of the state of the app. But if your argument includes like user emails and people can have to inspect your user database, sorry, that's the data leak. There you go. Job start and job done. So, right, just things to kind of keep in mind. Very useful. We want to make sure you protect them and put them behind. Other things to consider when writing background jobs, right? So if you want to retry it, maybe the job is, add $5 to your account, and maybe the job runs. Maybe it actually adds $5 to someone's bank account, but then it doesn't actually do some other step, and so claims to be a failure, right? Maybe in 5 minutes the job gets picked up again, and it adds $5 more, right? That's a problem because now the user only added in $5, but they actually got $10. Maybe that job keeps failing and keeps getting run again, and maybe it keeps giving them more money. So if you're going to retry jobs, it's important to think about, what is your job actually doing? Is it going to add things in which case if it if it retries, but some of it completes the first time, what will happen? So it's a good idea to kind of think about making your jobs kind of not like summation, but adding in like the state, so like setting a state to be something in the job. So if the job does get run twice, it's not going to be a problem. I think with jobs is it's useful if the job is going to fail to have it fail early on and to fail hard. So rather than fail at the end of the job, because the job then might get picked up again if you have a retry system, and it will execute the first half again and the second half. It's important maybe to, if you're going to fail, right, have a bunch of catches early on and fail early, so that at least you don't do like partial work and then have it report as a failure. So if you come in here and you see a job failed, you're to think, oh, none of it actually happened. But maybe it failed at the very last line of the job, right? If it did, then pretty much most of the job executed except the very last line, but it'll show itself to be a failure. So if you're going to fail, have a bunch of conditions early on, maybe to check a lot of things, your error validation, input validation, all this stuff early on in the job. So if it does fail, it fails early, so that you don't have these like kind of like unclear situations. Great. So we have Sidekiq set up locally. We have it running here. But how do we add it in to Heroku? So let's see where we're at. And it looks like we added in Sidekiq and a background job. Actually, I don't want to add it. Cool. I'm going to commit that. Oops, I don't want to add in. Oops. There we go. And I'll actually remove the dump file. If you look at the dump file, it's actually just from Redis. It's just write a bunch of hex. I'm actually going to add that to my git ignore. Dump.rgb. All right, so that we don't commit that to our git repository. Cool. Broadcast message job. Great. Now we're going to say what git push Heroku lecture 6 live master. I'll open up Heroku logs tail. Great. So it looks like it's non-fast forward. Okay. We are going to force this. Alrighty, so that'll push for us. And let's go back to our application. So we have our web server, which we ran locally with Rails server, right? We also have to run Sidekiq locally. Notice here actually the dyno formation. So you can start to define different types of dynos to handle different processes. And here we're using a web dyno, and it runs this service, right, the web. You notice the worker, it's off. So if we want to configure the dyno, if we wanted to, we could enable it, and you could actually edit it here, and you can enable it. But it'll run this command, bundle exec rake jobs work, which we don't need because we're using Sidekiq, right? So Sidekiq, I'm not sure if this command actually works, but we want to define it ourselves. If you actually notice when we push here, push was a success, it'll say no proc file detected. And so the way you can define different types of workers is with the proc file. And so it asks you actually to, it says we recommend explicitly declaring our services via proc file. So let's go ahead and create a proc file. So we can create subline proc file. And what does a proc file look like, right? Well, this gets picked up by Heroku, and it knows how to run different types of workers. So we have our web worker, and what is web going to run? It's just going to run this command. Here. And actually, if we inspect our logs, right, you'll notice here that we had to deploy. It picked up our new code, and then it's running here Rails server dot. Here it goes. That's our command, right? Bin Rails server, right? So it's going to run that to start the web service, which is great. So we want to keep that. We also want to define our worker, and our worker is what's going to do our background work for us outside the context of the web app. So we say bundle exec, and we're going to say Sidekiq, and we'll pass an environment. Let's say, for example, we wanted all of our environments. So if we wanted, like our staging environment or something to also hit production, we could just type in production. But we looks like we have Rails M defined, And if we're confused what it is, we can always go check it out. So we can ask for Heroku config. And it looks like we get it. Our Rails environment is fine to be production. Great. So we can do that here as well. Last thing to do is here right on our config, we have all these variables. If we want to, we also can define an environment variable inline. So we can say Rails max threads equals 10. And why would we do this? Well, maybe we don't want Sidekiq to use too many threads. So Sidekiq handles how it uses threads, and if it needs more workers, it'll add in more threads. But let's say, for example, our database is constricted on the number of connections we want. Each thread will open up a new connection to the database, which could slow it down. So we'll be a little conservative, and we'll define a maximum number of threads that we'll allow, so that in the worst case, it only opens up 10 threads, and it doesn't hammer our database connection limit. If database connection limit is an issue, that means you have a lot of users, which is great. There's a tool called PG Bouncer, actually written by Heroku. It pools all of your database connections together, and so it uses fewer connections, and it saves you on database performance. So if you ever get to the point where you are constrained on database resources, the connection limit, check out PG Bouncer. Great. So we have our worker. There's actually one more thing we can define, which is release, which is really handy. Heroku just added this in not too long ago, and it's actually not well known. But we can say bundle exec rails db migrate. And rather than having to run db migrate every time we push, and running the chance that we actually may forget to run this, the release command will get run whenever we actually push to Heroku. So that's pretty handy. We want to, for now, we want to actually go ahead and run the migration every time, so we don't forget. If your app starts to get bigger and you have more users, maybe you don't want to run this every time because it results in more downtime, right? But for now, we're totally happy to make that trade-off. So let's go ahead and push again. Add in a proc file. Great. Git push Heroku 6. And we'll clear out our logs. And now we won't get that warning that we don't have a proc file. Discovered proc file type, so it's really discovered for us. Release command, great. So recognize that there's a release command. And it recognizes our types. So now it's going to go ahead and verify the deploy. So it ran the release command for us, migrate our DB. In this case, no actual changes. Release is done. Great. Now let's see what it looks like. So this is our application. We have our logs running here. Cool. And looks like we have a Redis error. Execute command. So looks like our Sidekiq couldn't connect to Redis. So we'll go back to the logs, to the Sidekiq wiki, and home using Redis. So it looks like we didn't actually configure Sidekiq to use Redis. And it looks like it uses a Redis provider. So we have to define that. So our Redis is defined, right? If we forget, we can search for it. Our Redis is defined as Redis Cloud URL. And so it asks us to basically set the provider to be that URL. So we'll just say here, our Redis provider is there, just a pointer. Now if we inspect the config, we shall see Redis provider pointing to Redis Cloud. Great. And the application was restarted. Let's try it again. So now it's going to start our web service. It's going to start Sidekiq for us. And we send it, and it queue the job. And let's see if it picks it up. So we have our worker, bundle exec, Sidekiq. It looks like it didn't find it. Oh. So it looks like it didn't recognize a command for our worker. Bundle exec, Sidekiq. Let's do that. So our job isn't queued, but it looks like it actually didn't get picked up because Sidekiq isn't running. Yeah, so it's in queued. It's not actually running. Okay. So it looks like our command didn't get run. Try it once more. Bundle exec Sidekiq. Let's just check the wiki real quick. The Heroku page. No, there's not. Okay, so Sidekiq, Heroku. Here we go. Deployment. Okay, so looks like we did all the right steps. To try one thing. Oh, it did broadcast. Okay, so maybe it was this command that threw it off. Okay, but so right, we've Sidekiq set up and send us jobs, and if, for now we haven't protected it, so we can also inspect it and see what type of jobs are being run. It looks like the job is still queued. So that is Sidekiq. Very useful for running background jobs as well as ActiveJob. Right, to handle all sorts of things. One thing it talks about a lot in Sidekiq on the wiki is mailer. Yeah, so you can say run the job in 3 minutes from now, or run the job in 1 day from now. Yeah, you can specify. You can specify it down to the second, I think, when it should run. But yeah, Sidekiq is also used a lot with like mailer. So if you have anything that like emails out to people using Action Mailer, I definitely recommend putting that into Sidekiq so it doesn't tie up any actual web process. Instead, it's being run in the background. Very, very useful. Cool. So, are there any questions on Sidekiq or ActiveJob? Okay. So again, if this makes sense for your project, feel free to use it. At some point, most apps, after they've been around, will start to use background jobs. So it's definitely a big part of developing Rails apps is using background jobs. It's not too hard to set up and configure. It's just important to kind of keep track and think about what your job is doing, how am I rescheduling it, when these jobs are being scheduled, what happens if my queue gets to be too long, do I have any sort of metrics on that? Right, just concerns about having applications out there with background jobs. But to recap for today, we talked about Heroku, different commands, using an add-on to add in Redis, right, interacting with command lines, setting Redis up, and then we talked about ActiveJob, generating a job, right, moving some code to the background. So we have our job here that runs in the background, and we can call perform, and it goes ahead and does our action for us. Okay, so let's use the remaining time.